Welcome everybody to track 6 on the Giants Jukebox. Our playlist is on shuffle mode this year, so this is the fourth one of these that we're doing, but it's the third, fourth, fifth. Oh, I guess it's the fourth one in our sequence too. So we're actually on the right place on this one. We are glad that you are here. If you are viewing this live, we will be sending you sketch information at the end of the sequence all the way in March. So don't freak out if things don't appear in MoX tomorrow. It's going to come in a couple of months here. If you're getting this from this video after we've recorded, we're glad you're viewing the recap. Sorry you can't get the state clock hour, though. That's the rule. The goal of these sessions are to give you a bird's eye view of the entire Giants grade level. And while we'll get into the weeds on some of the activities in a few minutes, overall, we're going to try our best to give you a really good overall look of the entire sixth grade Giants course. And then we're going to pick out some of the key activities to help showcase what makes each of those grade levels tick. Tonight, you're only listening to me briefly before the much cooler experts, Carol Gershmel and Phil Gershmel, take over. So very quickly, my norms for the evening. If you need to step out for a second, come back in. That is totally fine. You guys are viewing this on your own time after a long day of teaching. So take care of your needs. That's basically my only norm for online learning. Our agenda for tonight, I'm going to do a very brief overview of the story of sixth grade social studies, and then we're really going to get into the weeds of what makes sixth grade tick. Sixth grade is a very unique course. It is the only truly skills-based course in our K-12 social studies lineup. And that's made it very interesting for Carol to do some of the updates, because instead of a skills course where we're relying on the same information over and over again, sometimes the information changes between pass-throughs. So Carol's been doing some excellent job updating some of these, and we really appreciate that. And that's really where we're going to live tonight, some of those really cool spatial thinking and even some literacy activities that exist in sixth grade social studies. When Carol was partnered with Sharon and Andrea, they did an impeccable job of embedding some great literacy activities in here. And while that won't be the focus of the evening, just know overall you're in very good hands. I will close the evening with a brief overview of assessments, like how to access them. And if you want to take one for a quick spin, we can do that. But really, the bulk of the time is going to be on that second bullet. I also wanted to let you know that while you will continue to access Giants from where you currently are, which is hopefully misocialstudies.org, Giants has now officially been adopted by the Michigan Council for Social Studies. So going forward, MCSS will be supporting the curriculum. As former president, current secretary, incoming treasurer, guy who's doing everything there, I could not possibly be more excited to bring us home to the place that I think makes the most sense. And going forward, too, we might be partnering with a couple of funding sources to potentially do some research on how well Giants prepare students for future success. So stay tuned. If you're interested in possibly participating in that, let me know. We're not off the ground running with that yet, but we are excited to potentially undertake this. So Giants formed out of the Michigan Open Book Project. I'm not going to give a huge spiel before. If you've never been to the Giants units before, though, there have been a variety of ways to access them in the past. Some of these are still alive and active, although finally Ottawa ISD set up every page to automatically redirect to this one. So I think if you're still going to any of the old oaisd.org pages, they should automatically redirect you here now, which is great. We are also constantly going through and trying to update things as links go dead, but always remember to email myself. That's david.johnson@wmisd.org. If you run into any issues, there's actually an email button at the bottom of this particular page that you can't see in this screenshot. But if anything goes dead, just shoot me an email and I will do my best to get it updated and fixed as quickly as possible. The activities you'll see tonight, most of those won't go dead because those are Google Docs that we own. But when we link out to other things, sometimes they go away. So, and I can usually find them again or find a suitable replacement. So just let me know. There is someone on the other end of those bug reports, and that person is me. Getting into the story of sixth grade, it's harder to tell a story when your course does not actually have, actual content, when it's a set of skills and an arc of geographic inquiry that kids have to learn. But I gave this some thought, and I've been trying to come up with a unofficial, and I say unofficial because in a lot of cases the unit writers are seeing these for the first time tonight, what is a good unofficial compelling question that makes up the whole course? And in this one, this was probably the easiest one for me to come up with because geography doesn't always get the time and attention that it needs and deserves. And this is a incredible course and an incredible grade level and an incredible opportunity to teach not just your kids, but administration, parents, and your community members. Geography matters. So if you want a unofficial question for the whole course, I might suggest you put this up all year. Why does geography matter? And by the end of the year, your kids are going to have about 10,000 different answers to it, all of which are valid and good. We also have sixth grade paced. These links on the pacing page work again. I didn't realize that they didn't, and so I went through and fixed them all. So you can access all the units from the pacing page, or you can access them directly from the hover over menus. But we've got a unit on physical geography. You'll notice most of these take about 7 or 8 weeks to get through. A good rule of thumb with us is if you're wondering how long a lesson, because there's usually only 3 or 4 lessons in a unit, if you're wondering how long a lesson should take, sixth grade has done a really good job of saying how long most of the steps in each lesson should roughly take. But if you're ever curious, a good rule of thumb, if you come across a grade level later that doesn't have that in there, is to just divide the number of weeks by the number of lessons, and that's a good rough estimate of how long you should spend on each one. But sixth grade has actual notations in here of how long each one of these should take. So that's because we are on our technically fourth pass through now, updating some of these links and preparing for tonight. The stories, the questions, our first unit, the major question is what environmental conditions make some places more desirable than others. We get into Phil's great work on conditions and connections and using that as kind of a framing tool for a lot of the geography that we're going to study this year. We don't do as much with the 5 themes of geography as you might be thinking a geography course might do. We've got some great, better ways to make geography education a little more understandable and flow a little bit better for your kids. We talk about temperature conditions at different latitudes and why that's important. We talk about precipitation and physical conditions. So our first unit is really over some of those environmental conditions. And if you are a 5 themes of geography fan, I think you can make some connections with the compelling question alone. Our second unit is how do population characteristics affect people in different places? This is a big unit, and I have 6th graders. They're 9th graders now, but I have 2 teenage daughters whose 6th grade or 7th grade teacher, I should say, because they do it in a different grade level there, did the Giants units that their class really, this unit really clicked with them. So I love this unit because the Johnson twins love this unit. How do population characteristics affect people in different places? So we get into everything here. We talk about population density. We talk about age distribution and why that matters and what that can, bring about. We talk about how countries meet the needs of their populations, or do they meet the needs of their populations? So I can tell you, as a parent of someone who went through these units specifically, this is a great unit. Not that the rest aren't either, but my daughters really took off during this one.
My kids loved the population counter, the ticker, oh my gosh.
Yes.
Yes. They loved it. They're obsessed. Waiting for it to turn. They love it. Yeah.
Well, 6th grade also has some civics and economic standards, and I was very curious when they first drafted these units how they were going to work those into a geography course, but by golly, they did it. So Unit 3, we talk about how do people's economic and political choices depend on local environmental conditions, but how do people also change those conditions? Like, that's a big mouthful of a question, but there's a lot in there. So that is our third major unit. Our fourth unit gets into cultures. So again, people expect to see some stuff on cultures in there, and we handle this beautifully. I believe this is also, Carol, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't this where Andrea and Sharon embedded the long walk to water?
Cultures.
Yeah.
Or it could also be, it could also be in Unit 5 where people move. where they
Well,
migrate.
they had some fantastic literature connection opportunities embedded in there. So if it's not with this unit, it's in a different one. But my point is they've got some great connections to bridge ELA and social studies together. And I remembered specifically because in the original rollouts they would read some brief passages, and I picked the book up. I'd heard about it, but them reading it aloud at the first round of Giants sixth grade overview made me want to actually read it. So that really cool. And then we finish with a final unit. How do patterns and rules about trade and migration affect people in different places? So that's where we get in here. This is a 2 unit lesson. Why and how do people, or this is a 2 lesson unit. How and why do people trade, buy and sell goods and services? So this carries over the remainder of those economic standards that got wedged into sixth grade. And then we get really into some major conversations about movement and migration. So it's hard to tell a story when you don't have physical content to tell, but by golly, Carol, Sharon, and Andrea, with a little bit of help from Phil, and I showed up and hit the record button on the old Adobe Connects, but that was about the end of my contribution to it. They really did it. These are my favorite units, so I'm looking forward tonight just as much as you are. A couple of quick notes. In there are some student journal ideas, some way to structure those, either digitally or by hand. So that's a great piece that we actually borrowed from sixth grade that ended up in fifth and seventh and eighth grade as well. So it's kind of a semi-common framework, even though it looks a little bit different here. There are 2 open source geography textbooks that you can use, and while we tend to link to open book, Geographic Big Ideas is the better fit. So if you've been using open book for that, you still get Geographic Big Ideas from the open book website. It's very easy to tell by the chapter titles, even though we haven't physically linked them all within the Giants units yet. It's very easy to tell from the chapter titles which one you should be following or which ones you should be following depending on each unit. So just note you have 2 geography options for that. And with that, I'm going to shut up and turn things over to, I don't know which one's going first, but if it's Carol
Phil.
or Phil. All right, I'm going to turn things over to Phil. So we've learned tonight how to bump each other off the share. So Phil will go ahead and bump me off the share.
Okay, so we got a title. These are the student activities more than the content, because we're delivering the content through these skill-based activities. There is an overview handout, which makes it possible to review this later. So you don't have to try to memorize everything that's being said as we're doing it. The activities are designed to meet Michigan standards in a way that also supports inquiry in world and U.S. history, and especially kind of wink, wink, current events of various kinds. So, as Dave said, the physical geography's compelling question was very simple. What environmental conditions make some places more desirable than others? And to go through that angle builds the mental map of the world. And we choose to do that with something that would support seventh grade's ancient cities right off the bat. Not that we memorize the names of any of these ancient cities, we just give them a map of where they're located. In the year 430 BC, all of those starred places were the top 12 cities in the world at the time. And the student task is to take a look at it and just try to draw a line around the region of ancient cities. Now, you might have to define region for them. That's fine. It's a place where there's a bunch of individual things that are like each other and fairly close to each other. In other words, like that. And then the presentation goes on to lead the students in a search for reasons why the cities are located in that small area. And to make a long story short, they wind up with a map that looks like this, that said, hey, those ancient cities were all in a very narrow band because there is only a very narrow band where in the year 430 BC, this is before different kinds of central heating, that you had to kind of live in the warm part of that just right zone in between the places that are just too hot and the ones that are definitely too cold. In other words, when we're teaching about ancient cities, the goal really is to say, Students should do an activity that helps you understand the system rather than just memorize some facts about that. And we, because we're geographers, focus on what we call spatial thinking activities. There is a whole lot of neuroscience backing this up that we don't have anywhere near time to go into. But the brain processes this spatial information in lots of different ways. And identifying a region takes a different brain network than looking for an association between things in the same place, which just coincidentally happens to be what we focus on in the next activity here. We're looking at spatial associations in South America. The students read short descriptions of all of the ingredients in a McDonald's Happy Meal. And then they try to figure out where they came from, because almost none of that comes from the United States anymore, you know. And they mark those locations on a map. What they do when they do this is to learn a very basic geographic fact that happens to be easy to illustrate in South America. It's what we call one of the big ideas. That as you go up a mountain, things change in predictable ways. And farmers respond by growing different things at different elevations. So the potatoes are grown up at fairly high elevation, and coffee and things like that are grown at relatively low elevations. We've got a link to an online clickable diagram that lets students explore these altitude relationships. And there is a clickable map of South America online that extends that inquiry to include mines, copper mines, major cities, historic features like the Inca Empire, as well as all these farm products. Now, I don't know whether you have used clickable maps before. It's a way that you can show one or two things at a time by clicking different buttons on or off. If you haven't used it, we can demonstrate a little bit during the question and answer period at the end. For right now, I'm just going to say that if you click the buttons that say mountains, rainforest, and metal mines, you can real clearly see that almost all of the metal mines are high in the mountains, but the rainforest is down on the lowland and it's near the equator. We found out that a lot of teachers, let alone students, can't put the equator on a map that doesn't have one. They just don't have a mental map of where it is. So we made an activity called Where's the Equator? It basically starts out by having you try to draw where it is. And then we've got a presentation that gives you 5 handy clues, any 2 of which will fix the equator fairly well. And one of them is relevant in South America, that the equator is right where the biggest river in the world enters the Atlantic Ocean. In other words, students learn the location of the equator, and coincidentally, the presentation shows them a number of important things that change as you go farther and away from the equator, just like temperature did with the ancient cities. And the students get to review major place names, continent names, subcontinent names, a couple big islands, oceans, bays, and so on. Another clickable map lets you explore the effects of latitude in Africa. One good way to start that out is to show them a map of where the ancient empires had their centers. And there were a bunch of ancient empires, you know, Aksum and Khanum and Timbuktu. And if you look at that pattern, they're all in a line, and they're in a very narrow latitude band. The students can use that clickable map to explore reasons why that might be the case. For example, if you turn on the rainy areas in July, that also appears to be linked to latitude. The rainy area seems to stretch from the equator to about 15 degrees north latitude. And all the empires are right in a string at the northern edge of that rainy area. There's a good reason for that. It didn't get quite enough rain to have enough vegetation to support really serious wildfires, And so these places they get a little bit of rain, but they don't get enough to have a big fire problem in the other half of the year. When the rainy belt is shifted south of the equator, uh, and all those capitals are right up there. That coincidentally happens to be where you can grow a grain that was important in the diet in Africa, and that grain is millet. Millet grows in the areas that get just barely enough rain, but not so much that they're going to have a wildfire problem. And if you add one more layer to that, you find out millet grows in an area that has just enough rain to support these ancient capitals, but you don't have enough rain for a lot of malaria mosquitoes. And now it makes a lot of sense why the capitals would all be located there. In other words, by using these clickable maps, they can learn a lot of basic geographic facts about Africa, that these environmental conditions are dominant at specific latitudes. And things like rainforests or grasslands, deserts, taigas, tundras, all appear at specific latitudes. And these are strongly influence human activity at these different latitudes. That the major grain producing areas are in particular latitudes. Population centers are almost all at the same latitudes. Which means that I have just done the transition into part 2, which is a compelling question about population characteristics. How do they affect people in different places?
Unit 2 focuses on populations, and I'm so happy that Dave's daughters found it interesting. Population is not just size, it's also how fast does a population grow, and what kind of ages are the people in that population? So we will take a look at those questions. Let's see. Here I go. Next one. There we go. We tried to give you just a simple map at first. And what we say at the top is you don't need to know the names of all the countries in the world, but if you're going to learn names of countries, it might help to know that some of the highest population countries out of all the 195 countries in the world. This is a pretty simple map. It's using a blue dot to say what are the 12 largest population countries. And we'll notice there are some in every continent, almost every continent. And one thing that we can ask students to do is to say, what continent has the really large countries? Yes, there are the US, Mexico, and Brazil in the Americas, but notice how many really large countries are in Asia. This is a more complicated map, but Phil and I, in the clickable maps, we wanted to be sure to include what geographers call dot symbol maps. And I think you can get a feeling that there are parts of the world that have more people or fewer people, and some of the parts of the world look really crowded. This is a clickable map that's found under the word demography in the clickable map section for the world. This dot maps are a nice way to compare the 3 largest countries in the world. India right now has the top population, China has a few less, and the US is farther behind, but it is the third largest population country. And I think India and China on the dot map really do look impressive. India and China each have more than 1 billion people. We will take a look here in Unit 2 at China. Phil will present what we have about for the US in Unit 3. And when I come back to Unit 4, we tell the stories about India. So we're going to look at some of these large population countries. Certainly all of these countries, we see them in current events. I'd like to focus on China because it's a great place to look at populations growing, or perhaps populations not growing or not growing so fast. China, for most of the world's history, had the world's largest population, and it's important to notice that China wanted to slow down the growth of its population. It started to take this government policy in the 1970s and tried even to force families to have only one child. Why would they do that? Well, for many, many years, China's mothers typically had 3 children, but China really wanted moms to have fewer than 3 children, to get down to 1 or 2 children. And we come to something that we ask students to do occasionally, and that is write down a definition in their journals. And the new word is fertility rate, which we define, and we'd like them to write down, as the average number of children a typical mom has in her lifetime. And, there's the possibility that moms might have 1 or 2 children, and this might be the case with many of 6th grade students. There's the possibility in countries other than the US that a typical mom may have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 children. One activity we have for students is that we use, again, a clickable map, and we have teachers can give their students a copy of the map, or they can work on a digital version of the map, the clickable map. But the point is, what are the parts of the world where currently, meaning as of 2015, typical moms had 1 or 2 children? Now, obviously, a mom in China would not have 1.7 children, but that means between 1 and 2 children. There are parts of the world, especially Europe and China and countries near China, that have what are called low fertility rates. But there are also parts of the world where we find 4, 5, or 6 children. I've circled 2 on this map. And can you find a nearby place, part of the world, where there are 4, 5, or 6 children per typical mom? And there we have Central Africa coming in as a high fertility region. And a very interesting question is, will these African countries keep having large numbers of children? I think we have a video in Unit 2 that where moms are asked in Nigeria, what do they think the ideal size of a family should be? Should it be 1 child like Nigeria? And they have very interesting video comments. Another activity in Unit 2 is to compare age groups. And generally, we can divide ages into 3 groups. The elderly, like me, what I used to be in, the working ages 15 to 64, and the ages of your 6th graders, which are young children between birth and age 15. And which age group do you think is most important to a country? Well, there are various ways to think about this. I suppose we could have the elderly have experience and that we can build on and share. So that's why it's good that I'm around. But what about the other two ages? What are really important things about those other two ages? One possible age answer is that the working ages are moms and dads and people who are over age 15 before they're moms and dads. They do the jobs that bring in the weekly and monthly and yearly salary that support younger and older people. Or why are children important? They're going to be the workers of the future who keeps our economy going, who take care of families. This is a very special kind of graph. It's called a pyramid, and it's sort of shaped like a pyramid. I'd like to point out on the screen, the elderly ages are at the top. And if we were stacking, if we were trying to show their numbers, they don't have very long bars. The younger ages, the highlighted in red at the bottom, are the children between 0 and age 15. And notice that they have much larger bars than the elderly people. This is China in 1990 when they were trying to have a one-child policy. And it was kind of starting in the 90s. And notice that in 1990, there are still pretty long bars, large numbers of children at the bottom of this special kind of graph. But we're going to see if that changes. Would they keep having lots of children? The concern, I think, that the Chinese government at the time in a one-child policy was that they needed to figure out how to feed, provide shelter and medical care, how to have schools, and especially how to have jobs available for the huge numbers of children. They had the largest number of children in the entire world in 1990. What happened? Go over to 2025 and look at how they shrunk the number of children compared to decades before. We do see in China fewer children under age 15 in 2025. I have to say that in 2025, the Chinese are kind of wondering whether maybe they should have more children, but that's another story. Are there parts of the world that tend to have fewer children? Well, it looks like in the United States, when you look at having less than 20% of your population as children, that happens in the United States. That also happens in most of Europe. It certainly is happening in China and nearby countries in Asia. But are there also parts of the world that have really high percentages of their population that are children? And again, where we saw high fertility rates in Africa, we see sometimes children are almost close to half the population. That's really quite a challenge for taking care of all of those children in Africa. We have been focusing on China and starting out with all of Phil's work that was adapted by Sharon and me. about 5 years ago. We have several presentations about China. I'm going to show you just a few of the slides. Again, this is a dot map, and it's like, oh my goodness. Aren't the dots kind of lopsided in just part of China? Where are people most crowded together in China? And we have a nice compass road, west and east up at the top, that students can make a generalization. How does China feed the second largest population in the world now, today in 2026? Where do Chinese farmers grow crops? This is also in the eastern part. Back to this notion of the importance of physical conditions. Where are the higher precipitation areas where you get enough rainfall to grow crops? In the eastern part of China. And we have several comparisons in the series of presentations about China where we compare the United States and China. The US and China have roughly similar areas, but China has 3 times the population of the United States. That is an important comparison. Very briefly, we can consider, knowing that China has, for most of history, had the largest population in the world. Are there advantages to having a large population? Well, 2,000 years ago, there definitely was. Chinese rulers were able to organize workers to build a wall that was thousands of miles long. When such a project would be immensely difficult. And the Chinese did that to defend that important farmland against invaders. On a map, if you look at the scale of miles at the bottom, the Great Wall, which was built in sections, is thousands of miles long. And there also, 2,000 years ago, Chinese rulers gathered together workers, forced workers sometimes, to build the Grand Canal so it could move food from the northern part of the country to the southern part of the country, or vice versa, actually. We ask students to investigate China's history, population characteristics, physical environments, accomplishments, because China has been important in world history and in current events. There are other presentations in Unit 2. And I'll show one short example about how countries face challenges of meeting health needs. We ask students to focus the darkest colors on this map because this map is about children who do not have enough food to weigh what they should at their age. This is a map about malnutrition where we have parts of the world where 40 and 50% of the children are underweight or malnourished. Which continents have the worst problem with this? And sometimes, even though students haven't made the map, it's really important that they can circle something on it, or that they can then put into words what they see, verbalize a summary that, oh my goodness, there may be a problem with malnutrition in parts of Africa and parts of Asia. So I should give this to Phil. We're going to have Phil go next so he can start sharing and get me out of this.
You might have gathered that we've been talking a little bit about this all along. We've been building by looking at Africa and South America in that first unit on environment, and then looking at China and South Asia in the second unit about population, we've been building up a lot of facts about human-environment interaction without actually talking about it. And in the third unit here, we kind of try to bring those ideas together to say, how do the economic and political choices that people are able to make in a particular place, how do they depend upon the local environmental conditions, and how those choices can change those local environmental conditions? And that's the focus on this third one here. For this, we're going to start by looking at North America because people already have some background about what North America is like, but we want to organize that. And one of the powerful tools that geographers use to organize information is the concept of a region. And like I say, we've been mentioning the word all along. We just want to make sure that students really get the idea. And so we've got a unit, a lesson specifically about making the regions of North America. There is a presentation, like a lot of the lessons. It's a step-by-step guide to how to draw lines to divide North America into a handful of environmental regions. And what students get out of this is a durable mental map of a continent that can help them organize a whole lot of other information when we're looking at it. The map that you see on the right, by the way, is a typical sixth grader's answer on a pop quiz that some of the teachers that have used this already gave us a handful of the maps that their students drew. And frankly, I'm kind of impressed that this is somebody that didn't know this quiz was coming along, and look at the quality of their answer. Like I say, the unit works to build this durable mental map. And you need that mental map when you start interpreting some things about American history. For this particular activity, they read a real short paragraph about the Homestead Act and how you could claim free land out on the frontier if you just went out there and managed to survive for 5 years. After you do that, there's a list of the tools that you might want to take along with you, and we make it a mathematics lesson. You're only allowed a certain number of pounds of tools because that's all your wagon is going to be able to carry. And we got the idea of what some of these tools weigh here. What the students ought to get out of this is to see that their choice of tools is going to depend upon a whole lot of things. Their own goals, their personal evaluation of their skills. You know, there's no sense taking a tool that you don't know how to use. And their ideas about the conditions that they might face. And that's where things get a little bit tricky here. Because the presentation asks you bluntly, if you grew up in this log cabin, what tools do you want to take in order to start your own farm? And the students go and they put together, a list of the tools they're going to put in this wagon. And then you show up in the new environment and you've got another question. What happens when you move to a place where all of these tools that you've got, I mean, the way the PowerPoint says it is out here, an axe, a saw, a corn planter, a shallow well pump, and a wood-burning stove are about as useful as an airplane made out of bricks. It was a culture shock that hit these people when they moved into a region where their tools didn't work. We take that idea then to look at another part of the world. And the focus for the next section is on Russia. And they use the clickable maps to ask very simple question. What percentage of Russia is actually north of the Arctic Circle? That gets no sunlight whatsoever for half of the year. And to help them out a little bit, the clickable map lets them turn on the 4 states of North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and you find out that just about all of Russia is north of the UP. In other words, north of the part of Michigan where we don't even bother to try to grow any food. Clickable map lets you turn that on, you can find out that very little of Russia is warm enough to grow some food. This is one reason why Putin wants to capture Ukraine, that the two little parts of Ukraine that he's already captured have almost doubled the food production capability of Russia. A new presentation starts out by showing where Ukraine is located between Russia and Europe. And the presentation goes on to talk about the resources that are available in the Ukraine. Now, resources turn out to be anything that people have learned how to use, but there is a limit on that a little bit, because the lessons go on to look at the resources of Russia. And you find out that the huge size of Russia gives it a lot of geologic complexity. So it's got an awful lot of mineral resources, but almost all of those mineral resources are in a part of the world where the ground stays permanently frozen. In other words, it's really hard to operate a mine in Russia. They'd much rather capture the mine in the Ukraine where it's warm enough that you can operate for a while. Like I say, the PowerPoint presentations go back and forth between these ideas. The resources are not just what's there, but what's there that you can grab with the technology that you've got. And then it goes to the main resource in world trade today, and that is petroleum. And using Russia as a benchmark on here, they look at the production and the use of petroleum in different world regions. And they can learn what parts of the world are going to be able to make money by exporting oil. Russia produces 4 billion barrels a year, but it consumes only 1 billion. On the other hand, Europe produces 2 and consumes 7. So Europe has got to buy energy from somewhere. And doing it this way, where you just have circles, that production and use, you can compare these things in different world regions. So we've got a handful more activities that reinforce this basic idea that the environment that you've got in the place has a strong influence on human activity. But this goes both ways, because human activity can also have an effect on the surrounding environment. And here, the United Nations has made some really cool maps, and we have the students explore these maps. They're maps of the human footprint. The human footprint being defined as just all of the impacts on environment, soil erosion, air pollution, anything that we might do. And guided by a presentation, they study maps that will show the human footprint on different continents. We'll go back to Africa, because remember, they already had a kind of a mental map of where Africa was, and they can compare that mental map with the human footprint in Africa. You can see that that little band of latitude that is just wet enough to grow grain, but not wet enough to support a lot of malaria, is also a place where the humans have had a lot of effect on the environment. A lot of habitat loss, a lot of soil erosion, a lot of wind, a lot of what we call desertification. And then it gets to the really big question about human footprint, and that is the global footprint from carbon dioxide. And there's a handful of videos that have graphs in them, and then label the graphs to show the amounts of carbon dioxide emitted by different countries. And they examine additional graphs that show how temperatures have changed. In other words, they're getting background about a possible relationship here. And this becomes a dicey area, because the real question is, are they also covering this topic in their science classes? And if they are, then geography is going to step back and just say, we want to know where in the world it's happening, but we're not going to spend a whole lot of time. On the other hand, if they're not covering it in science, this is really a topic that Americans ought to know something about. And so we've got a couple supplementary units about carbon dioxide and some of the possible mitigation strategies and so on. Like I say, this is one where You just have to look at what's happening elsewhere in the curriculum to decide how much emphasis we're going to put on the topic within the geography class. But we've opened the door for it with this discussion of human environment interaction.
Do you see PowerPoint 4?
I do. You're good to go.
Okay, I figured it out. All righty. Here we go. Unit 4 is about cultures, and it's important to note that that's a plural. There really are many different cultures, and one of our questions is how they differ, but how do they get along with each other? And so here again, we ask the students to put into their journal a really important definition. Just as we did fertility rate for Unit 2, cultures is the definition in Unit 4. Cultures are ways to think and act and work. It's kind of how do you do things? But the other important aspect of culture is that people learn and share with each other. And so you're probably going to learn a language, you're going to experience a religion, you're going to think about what should a house look like because of what you've learned by people that you're close to, especially early in life. And so we will go on here. One aspect of culture is religion. There are many. One of the first things we do with religion is we ask students to read pictures so that they can compare 5 religions. 3 of the 5 religions are tremendously important. Christianity, Hinduism, and Islam all have more than 1 billion followers. This is close to half the world belong to these 3 religions. Here's an example of a comparison that we ask students to do just to get them familiar with different religions. Christians have a book that they consider sacred as a guide, but Jews, people who follow Judaism, have a different book called the Torah, which is in part different from the Bible. And if you are Muslim or a follower of Islam, the really sacred book in your life is called the Quran, which usually is written in Arabic. As students look at pictures about religious buildings, religious books, religious images, and maps, they record some very basic characteristics of the religions. We do make note, and this will come up later, it's very interesting that 3 of the religions that we're talking about all started in the same part of the world that we refer to as the Middle East. 2, Hinduism and Buddhism, began in a region of the world called South Asia. We try to have a little bit of, have I heard of these religions before? And on the one side of this slide, we have a list of religions. And on the other side, we have a list of numbers. And we asked students if they could guess which are the religions that have more than 1 billion followers. And we always provide an answer. And I am told by teachers that part of this answer is surprising. And I'm not, and what I'm told by teachers is that a lot of students have never thought, I think it's possible that students would guess that Christianity has more than 1 billion. Christianity has the largest number of followers. Islam is also way over 1 billion. But the third one in the list, non-affiliated, is surprising to some students. It is a surprise that, well, they want to know what non-affiliated means, and that means that people seem to have not chosen a religion to be a follower, to follow. And I could see where that has happened in countries like Russia, the former Soviet Union, where religion was not encouraged. I could see where that might happen in parts of China. But anyway, and we should, of the top 4, we should also notice that Hinduism is a huge number of 1 billion followers. As in many of the other units, we use clickable maps for building presentations, for reviewing presentations as activities for students. And there is a section under the world history and geography where you can click on religions and you will get a wonderful clickable map. We ask students to compare which of these 2 religions, Hinduism or Islam, have spread from where they started. And it's just fascinating how Hinduism stayed where it started. Mainly, it spread only a little bit, whereas in contrast, Islam began in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, and spread into Africa, into other parts of Asia, and parts of Europe, and the United States, but not so much in large numbers in the US or in Europe. How did Christianity spread? Well, there are many, many different groups of Christians, and we've chosen just to show Roman Catholic Christians. Roman Catholic Christianity started out in the Middle East. All Christianity started out in the Middle East. And notice how it spread quite significantly into Europe, into North and South America, into Central Africa, and into a few parts of Asia and also Australia. We will also look at the spread of languages, but just getting used to the possibilities of languages being something that is learned and shared. One question is, which language did your students learn to speak as a child? The reason we ask this question and make a point of learning a language as a child is the data we will show you later is about native speakers of languages. What languages were learned when people were children? The top 10 language in terms of numbers of native speakers who learned it as children are Spanish, English, but the largest is Mandarin, which is the major Chinese language. And something we ask students to watch for is how 2 languages, notice again English and Spanish, how two languages spread from a starting place. Oops, going this way. And those two languages are English and Spanish. And looking at the top, English was spread out of Britain when Britain sailed to other parts of the world and took over colonies and built cities and colonies and controlled what are now independent countries, but were then colonies. This all started in the 1600s, and Britain carried English to many, many parts of the world. Every single continent. In contrast, Spain, in the bottom map, had colonies, but notice which parts of the world Spain took Spanish to. We've looked a bit at religions, we've looked at languages, and now we're going to look at parts of the world, and we'll see languages and religions cropping up in these parts of the world. And they're going to be very religious, and language cultures are really very important in these different parts of the world. First, we look at Europe, which is a small part of a much larger continental landmass called Eurasia. US I've labeled over there for reference. Europe is just a wonderful part of the world to see many cultures. And we might wonder, well, why does Europe have so many cultures? It certainly has many languages and religions. And a word to keep in mind as we look at Europe is complexity. And something we're going to notice that contributes to complexity in Europe are some physical features like peninsulas and mountains. I used to try to draw the map of the world when I was younger. I don't know why I did that, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed making squiggly lines to show Europe. And Europe certainly has a lot of squiggly coastline. Europe also has many peninsulas. It has big ones in the north, for example. The middle one that is pointed to here is Denmark, that is currently in the news. And then probably this big boot-shaped peninsula, Italy. And one thing to note, this is Phil's characterization of peninsulas, is a peninsula is a kind of like a room that you enter, and the room has only one door, especially when the past, when there was less sailing and more people moving around on the ground. And the point about having only one door to your peninsula is that if an enemy wants to attack by land, it can only come from one direction. We point out many peninsulas, big and little, and Phil has another way of talking about peninsulas, and they're like many small closets, and those closets are able to defend and keep their separate cultures, their separate languages, their separate religions, their separate customs. This is a wonderful aspect of using the clickable maps. Students are able to turn on mountains. And one thing what we've turned on here is just mountains, and two of the peninsula, the Spanish peninsula and the Italian peninsula have mountains that kind of guard the door to their peninsula. The Pyrenees Mountains that separate France and Spain would be very hard to go over if you wanted to attack between those two places. On the clickable map, students can turn on mountains, and they can also turn on borders of countries. You can see there are many countries fairly small, many of them fairly small, but what we've highlighted here is some very clear examples of where a border has mountains that are separating parts of the peninsula. In Europe today, there are 50 independent countries in a land area that is comparable to the United States. We have one country. Europe is divided into 50 independent countries, and peninsulas, and this ability to be separate, defend yourself, helps us to understand why Europe is divided into so many different countries. When you have separateness, when you have different countries, there's opportunity for both conflict and cooperation. There have been terrible wars throughout Europe's history. Some of the most destructive ever wars in the entire world were World War I and World War II. Both started in Europe. And it is fortunate that we are now, after World War II, that ended about 80 years ago when I was born. And recently, European countries have made agreements about cooperating. They are not like the United States with one federal government. They still are separate countries, but they have agreements about traveling freely. The ones that you see in blue are part of something called the European Union, and people can travel very freely. They can use one currency, one type of money throughout all of that blue area. And they're working on rules that can be agreed on by all 27 countries. So we've looked at cultures in Europe, and we move next to South Asia. South Asia, just like Europe, is also part of the Eurasian landmass. I think South Asia kind of stands out with its triangular shape. And we will look at what's kind of special and unusual about South Asia. And Phil pointed this out. This is a great reason for using a clickable. We are able to turn on mountains. Again, physical characteristics being important in Eurasia just as they were in Europe. And we can see that there's a wall of mountains, largely the Himalayas, the tallest mountains in the world, that kind of separate South Asia from the rest of the Eurasian continent. In fact, there's not only the world's highest mountains, which you see in this slide as labeled as number 2, but there's a terribly dry desert to the west, and there are deep difficult to cross river canyons in the east, number 3, all of which are kind of like a natural fence, which before people were using sailing ships and before they could use airplanes, they really fenced off South Asia. It was difficult for armies to invade by land, and it was difficult for other religions to either come peacefully or invade by force. It was difficult for other languages to invade or come by force. Remember that we saw earlier that the Hindu religion filled up this triangle of South Asia. It began in South Asia, stayed, and grew. If we, rather than looking at the past, we come far closer to today, and we have a series of presentations and clickable maps that help students to gain a background about what might be behind conflicts in South Asia. When we look at today, countries in South Asia, we have 3 countries: Pakistan, India, the largest in the center, and Bangladesh, which is small. All 3 are in the top population countries in the world, but they are different. Pakistan is close to 100% followers of Islam, Muslims. Bangladesh is 90% followers of Islam, and India is 80% people who follow Hinduism. This, you might imagine, there are minority religions inside India, particularly Muslims, people who follow Islam, and being a minority has been difficult sometimes in India. There are conflicts between the countries. Notice that we are missing a border. Nobody can agree on a border. For more than 40 years, nobody has been able to agree on a border in a part of the mountains that are very important to both Pakistan and India. There has been threats of fighting, small skirmishes, larger skirmishes. Both Pakistan and India have armies, both have nuclear weapons, and both want to control the water that comes out of the snow that melts in these high mountains. India wants the water to go to its farmers. Pakistan wants the water to go to its farmers. And remember that both of these countries have large populations. Pakistan has a lot of desert. India has 1 billion people, the largest population in the world. So we have conflict among different countries, which also have different cultures. We move next from South Asia to what is called Southwest Asia. It is also called the Middle East. And it really is in the middle. A portion of it, the Middle East, includes Africa. A tiny portion includes Europe, and a big chunk includes Asia. Why is the Middle East, why is Southwest Asia something that we'd really like students to know about? Well, when they get to world history, this is where we found ancient cities. In terms of religions, this is where important religions were born and still exist. It is the birthplace of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There are enormous oil reserves in the Middle East, and I'm afraid that in current events, whether you look at 2025 or go back to 2015, there have been wars, and the most recent ones have been terrible, and our students have probably seen them in current events on the news. One activity, again, is students can use the Middle East clickable map to find countries that have oil and oil to sell. And you might note, you see that Iran has oil. Iran has been in the news lately. Saudi Arabia has oil. Iraq and Syria, where there were wars as of 2015, they have oil, and it is, these are important countries. I've named the larger ones or the ones that have had wars recently, but there are smaller countries that I haven't named that are able to sell oil to the rest of the world. We said earlier when we talked about Islam that its origin is in the Middle East, in this part of the world. And one thing that we'd like students to see is where there are different groups, different types of Islam. One major group of Islam has lots and lots of followers, as you can see by the S's on the map, in Iran. Iran is in the news. The followers of Shia Islam, many of them are in the streets, rioting, questioning the rulers of the country who happen to be religious leaders in Shia Islam. There was a war in the past in Syria where the rulers who had the upper hand for a while were Shia rulers in Syria. It's not so much the religion as which rulers have power. The clickable map also allows us to see where a different group of followers of Islam called Sunni are, and a really important country for Sunni Islam is Saudi Arabia, which we've highlighted on the map here. We will see that there are many followers here of Sunni. Remember, though, that Saudi Arabia is where the religion of Islam began, kind of over here on the coast. And part of the reason that I've put in red is that we're showing you where there are followers of different types of Islam is there have been wars. For example, in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, between Sunni and Shia who lived there and who wanted to be the ruling group. One last thing to highlight in the Middle East is a very small country that we also find labeled on the clickable map of the Middle East. And this very small country is Israel. It has a Jewish minority, although Muslims and Christians live there. People who follow Judaism have the majority and control the government. Also, in recent current events, undoubtedly students have seen that there has been a war between Israel and a very tiny portion, a very small piece of land called Gaza that is next to Israel. And undoubtedly students have seen, and in Gaza, the inhabitants of Gaza are mainly Muslim, following the religion of Islam. One concluding slide about the Middle East is hopefully we can give students enough background that they can talk about conflicts and perhaps resolutions to conflicts and the importance of figuring out who wants to control the government. In the past, there were parts of the Middle East that were controlled by European countries. For example, the British and the French controlled Syria. France controlled Syria. The British controlled Iraq. Does an outside country, does that get a say in what happens inside a country of the Middle East? Does an army inside a country get the most say or part of the say in who controls a country? Or do the people who are richest, perhaps rich because they have oil riches, do they get a say in the governing of the country? Does a particular religious group get a say in the governing of the country? To what extent do people get to choose the leaders of their country or to give advice to the leaders of their country? Do the leaders of their country pay attention to groups of people? These are some of the questions that arise when we look at the Middle East. We started working on grade 6 curriculum in about 2016, and the teacher consultants who were helping back then were Sharon and Andrea, and they came up with the most wonderful literature connections. And please let us know if there are things that you think we should add or suggest or emphasize. One thing that Sharon asked me to remind you about is for Unit 4, there's a book called This Child, Every Child. It has really short 1 and 2 page readings, and that are really appropriate for Unit 4. Are boys and girls treated equally? Or there's a reading about children and war, which would be very important today. And so we encourage you to investigate what we called, Sharon and Andrea called the literature connections. Sharon and Andrea also advised that they really wanted me to point out a website that we connect students to, and it's called, or its short name, we call it Dollar Street. And it's where students get to read pictures and compare pictures. It fits Unit 4 because, in a sense, what we put in a house, or not only that kind of house we build, but what we put into it, are an important part of our culture. And if you click on this link to Gapminder, which had produced this wonderful website with pictures, you get a chance to say, well, I just want to look at, like their first example, I want to look at families. I want to look at families in the world by income. And my goodness, there are families with incomes of $27, $179, $578, and $10,000. Or you can say, instead of saying, I want to look at families, I want to look at kitchens in the world or bathrooms in the world. It's really eye-opening for our American students to look at this. And after we have Phil present Unit 5, we can go to reflections and questions. So Phil, we will share.
Unit 5, the compelling question is about patterns and rules about trade and migration. That when Carol was talking about these cultural differences, they often lead to product differences, and then people look at what other people have and they say, hey, I want some of that. And you wind up with some kind of trade connection. And these trade connections have been there for a very long period of time. We start out by making sure that the connection between goods and services is really pretty important. And they view a presentation that explains the difference, and then the students try to classify our mode of people into whether they are goods producers or service producers. And why this is important is that it's really hard to talk about jobs, trade, unemployment, if you don't see that there are very different kinds of jobs within each culture. And even in some area that's as small as the state of Michigan, there's been a dramatic difference over time in the amount of manufacturing jobs compared to the amount of jobs and services. That manufacturing has gone down by a couple 100,000, and services have gone up by a couple 100,000 just since 2001. The follow-up presentation explores different ways in which these jobs can change over time. And the fact is that there are a lot of different ways. Sometimes manufacturing jobs have, in fact, moved to other countries, but not all of them. Some of them have disappeared. You know, most of the coal mining jobs did not move somewhere else. They just disappeared when we invented new technology called the longwall mechanical coal miner. Robots and computers are doing a lot more of the dull and dirty and dangerous jobs. And people need to learn new skills if they want services jobs, because some of the decline in manufacturing jobs has been simply statistical. That what used to be called a small factory, as soon as the owner of that small factory decides that he just doesn't want to do his taxes by himself, and he hires an outside consultant to help him write his taxes, part of the manufacturing jobs have decreased and service jobs have increased. And we need to pay attention to this as we look at different trade topics. A lot of the rhetoric right now about trade that's floating around in the United States is just because people are unaware of these distinctions. So with that distinction in mind, we take a quick look at the geography of manufacturing. The student's job is to examine a data table and just to mark the number of states that are in the top 12 of manufacturing, top 10. And here they are. And then it's, what do they have in common? And one thing that they have in common is every one of them is on a coast of some kind, either an ocean or Great Lake, because shipping by water is a whole lot cheaper than with a truck or a train. In other words, it's important to consider not just geographic conditions, but also connections when you try to decide what economic activities are going to work in a particular location. And that in turn is, what can you trade with somebody else? Because if you can't do something and want to buy it, you're going to have to figure out what you can sell in order to get the money that it takes to buy it. And we start out by saying, well, there's some things we just don't like to do, like sewing clothes. And an activity that students should do is just to look at the labels on their clothing or their toys and find out where they came from. It's kind of eye-opening. This is one teacher's map of where their clothing in their closet came from. And as you can see, it's about a dozen different countries around the world. That background leads us into the next question, that if you're going to buy something from somewhere else, you've got to have something to sell to somewhere else in order to make the trade. And for that, we have students go out to a website and compare graphs for the main products and the export partners for different states. You're looking at graphs of Michigan, Texas, and Iowa, who they sell to, and other graphs that I'm not showing you is what they've got to sell. They realize when they do this that every place has to have some big jobs. Now, that's an acronym that we made up. It stands for Basic Income Generating Jobs. And a basic income generating job is a job that you can sell to somebody outside of your local area. And we have maps of, where the parts from some factories in Grand Rapids are sold around the world. Different places have to have different big jobs because you've got to use your local resources, your local skills, and the unique connections that you've got. All of that is background for the really big question about balance of trade. And it's true that, trade is imbalanced all the time. I pay a whole lot more for haircuts than the haircut guy is willing to pay me for geography lessons. So I have to sell the geography lessons to somebody else, who in turn sells something to somebody else. And the trade tends to be unbalanced if you look at only one measure. And the students here look at videos and presentations that show the balance of trade in goods and services. Because the United States imports a lot more goods than we sell, but we sell a lot more services than we import. And the result is, if you look at only one of those, you're going to think, oh, we're really out of balance here. All of this is to build better background for a structured debate. And what the website has got is about a half dozen of these diagrams for different questions. This happens to be, should there be more manufacturing jobs in the United States? In other words, should we encourage factory owners to start making more things here? And we talk about the positive and negative consequences. In other words, it's just a form to help you structure a debate for whatever question happens to be in the news when you're teaching the class. And that might be unemployment one year, and it might be manufacturing jobs the next year. It might be balance of trade the next year. It might be tariffs some year. I don't know. To put all of this into perspective internationally, we've got a very short map activity about container ports. They view a presentation as to what a container port looks like, and then they look at a map that compares the volume of trade going in and out of the top 30 container ports around the world. And what you see when you do this is you realize that the Port of Los Angeles, which is by far the biggest one in the United States, doesn't even make it into the top 10 internationally. In other words, we're not as big a player in trade as some people might think we are. That there's a lot more trade going on between other countries that are smaller and have fewer resources and therefore need to trade more in order to get things that they want. And that's kind of an eye-opening thing for some students. When we're talking about trade, we've been talking about the trade in goods and in services. There is a third kind of trade or movement, and that is the movement of people from one place to another, either for permanent jobs or just for temporary jobs. The United States used to make a lot of money with foreign students who would come to our universities and then pay rent to our apartments and so on. So we want to look at immigration and what the trends have been over time. Here we've got a unique kind of graph. The graph is made out of a bunch of piled up suitcases where each suitcase represents 500,000 people. And what you see is that over time, immigration has changed a lot. It's gone up some years and it's gone way, way down, like in the 1930s during the Depression. Almost nobody wanted to move to the United States. We also see that the origins have changed dramatically. That back in the early 1900s, almost everybody who came here came from Europe. But if you look at the 1990s, you find out that Europe was only 3 out of about 20. And the rest of the suitcases all came from Asia and from other parts of Western Hemisphere, South America, and so on. What they get when they color these things is a mental image of the volume and the sources of immigrants for each decade since the 1830s. Because these immigrations have changed with regard to economic conditions and our changing laws about immigration. And in this particular activity, the students view presentations and videos that talk about the purposes and the effects of immigration laws over time. What this gives them is some background for interpreting not just the suitcase graph, but personal stories about immigration. And the website has got a bunch of these short stories from different people as to the reasons they came and what happened to them when they did arrive here and so on. These are primary documents about people from Bulgaria or from Hungary, from South America. And then finally, the presentation have got data about immigration to Michigan over time. Where did people come from and when did they come? And a list of websites that people can go to look at their own personal immigration history and other information about immigration to Michigan. Now that's talking about immigration to Michigan. The geography of immigration has changed in another way, and that is, where did the people move in the United States? And here we show that where they moved tended to be linked to where were the jobs at the time. These two maps show where the jobs were in manufacturing and agriculture in 1890. And when you take a look at those and try to predict where did people want to move, well, here's where they did move in 1890. And as you can see, hardly anybody moved to the Southeast because there just weren't jobs available there. This helps us understand why the populations in different regions of the country have different background characteristics. And those background characteristics affect their behavior today, the economy today, and their voting behavior. So this is good background for talking about political issues. And political issues, as Carol said with the culture section, kind of depend on your population history there. So, to summarize all of these lessons that we've been talking about, these student activities are designed to meet specific standards for 6th grade world geography, standards about religion, about environment, about population, and about migration. And we're trying to meet them in a way that can support the student inquiries in world and U.S. history. And that's why it's kind of advantageous that Dave and I had been working on the 7th grade world history and the 8th grade US history. So we've got an idea what we want 6th grade to help us out with. The activities are designed to reinforce each other and to build on activities that were done in earlier grades. In other words, we don't think of these activities as standing alone. They're connected to each other. And in that sense, we have designed activities that specifically have different engines. By an engine, we mean, what does the student actually do? Do they read something? Do they make a graph? Do they read a map? Do they make a map? Do they compare things? Do they look at 2 graphs of population pyramids or whatever? Our main goal is to fit each topic within an approach that is proved to be effective for that topic. But there is a secondary goal, and the secondary goal is to enhance interest by adding some day-to-day variety to the class. So if you do these different activities, students will be doing different things. And given individual differences in the classroom, sometimes some students do some of these things better than others, and they can be your section leaders that time. That's worth noting. So, having said all of that, you don't have to use them all. You can start slowly, try just a few presentations and activities, and keep adding as you see fit. But keep in the back of your mind, these are designed to support each other as part of a carefully structured course. And I hope that came through when Carol and I were talking, that some of the things that she was talking about in the section about culture related back to human-environment interaction. And some of my trade things linked all the way back to environment and to agriculture and so on. So with that, we're at Dave to talk a little bit about assessment and a question and answer period.
All right. Well, thank you guys both. I love tuning into these on nights when I am not responsible for delivering much in terms of the content, because it's like great PD for me. Even though in some cases I've seen some of these things done multiple ways, I pick up something new every time. And before I talk briefly about assessments, I just wanted to remind everyone that yes, to emphasize again what Phil just said, it takes 3 to 5 years to get good with any curriculum. And there are districts out there that have adopted this whole scale that sometimes email me and are like, I'm only on unit 1 and it's February and I don't know what to do. And I always let them know that that's fairly normal as people start to go through things. I don't think I've gotten a unit 1 in February question, but definitely people who feel like they're not where they're supposed to be. So remember, it takes 3 to 5 years to get good with any curriculum. And if you have the freedom and flexibility to try things out, there's a person who wasn't here tonight, but who piloted Giants for her district that actually their entire district ended up K-8 adopting the Giants curriculum because she piloted 6th grade last year and did little bits and pieces of it. And now this year they're attending each of these rollouts alongside of many of you. So it takes 3 to 5 years to get good with anything. So take your time. And if you have the opportunity to kind of pilot and play with some stuff in advance, go for it. Do it. All of the things that you saw tonight are representative of what that whole curriculum looks like. So in terms of assessments, 6th grade was one of the first ones to have some assessments to go with them. They're in Google format, not in Google Forms. We've had some requests to get things moved into Google Forms so that there's some auto grade features, but it's actually, as we continue to investigate that, doesn't look quite as feasible. But Andrea and Sharon did come up with some assessments that you can either adapt if you're using something like Schoology that has its own assessment engine in there, or you can use them verbatim as they are right now in kind of a Google format. They use Google Sheets for this, where the questions in many cases are actually the background, so kids can't edit that, and then kids are actually able to interact with the sheet or the Google slide presentation to do their questions. It does require a little more manual grading on the teacher's end of things, but again, you can take it and use it as a base and put it into whatever learning management system you're using. Now, to access those, we don't have anywhere on the website that says click here for assessments, and that is because Kids are fairly good at Googling things, as we've learned over the years, and so we like to keep that under lock and key. So if you are in need of those assessments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Carol or Phil. Carol usually forwards them on to me because she's super busy. And I can get them to you in a matter of seconds when I get the email. So give me an email at david.johnson@wmisd.org. That would be whiskey mango internet school David, I guess, for the letters there, because sometimes my D's sound like T's. But I can get you access to those assessments if you need them. So don't hesitate to reach out. As far as the Q&A goes, we actually took a break midway through and got some questions answered. So I will pause for just a second to see if there are any others. On a Zoom call, I do 3 deep breaths, and if no one has unmuted or typed in the chat by the end of that third deep breath, I consider it a no more needs to be said on that front. So, Carol or Phil, anything else you'd like to say before we break for the evening?
Oh, it's a big sigh of relief.
Well, you guys did great, and this is now going to be up for everyone to see for ages to come as a great kind of overview. So I didn't really talk about it at the beginning, but this really stemmed out of a request from a couple of districts who loved the 2-hour video recaps for each unit, but didn't always have time at the start of a school year to watch them all. So they're like, "Do you have where's the hour and a half, 2-hour movie on the grade level as a whole?" And we'll fill those pieces in. So that's where this really came from, and I really liked the idea. And I don't ever want Phil and Carol to go into full retirement. So anytime I'm like, "Hey, Phil, we got more Giants to do," I drag them both along. So really appreciate your time and attendance this evening. And I'm going to stop the recording, and we will see you soon. We'll be back here in just a couple of weeks to talk fourth grade.